If you are caring for someone else, whether paid or unpaid, and no matter how many hours you do it, did you realise that you may be missing out on thousands of pounds of discounts for things that you may use every day? The Able to Care podcast is proud to be sponsored by the UK's #1 carers card. Started by two best friends who recognise that carers deserve better and are 100% committed to helping to change the lives of all carers and bringing them together as a strong community. Carers Card UK provides support, recognition and rewards. It offers reassurance by providing an ID card that helps access emergency information when needed, while also unlocking discounts, a wellbeing hub, a carers circle tool and a community through their app. All of this for less than the price of a box of chocolates a year. There are discounts on gym membership, days out, electrical goods, clothing and even glasses. Let others know you care while taking a little care of yourself with an ID card you can be proud of. Visit carerscarduk.co.uk/promo code/able to care today to order yours. So Sabera, first off, thank you so much for joining me. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you face to face as well. We haven't actually had a face-to-face meeting. We've only had conversations over WhatsApp and over the phone, haven't we? So it's amazing to see you. So as I said in the introduction there, obviously you're, and we've had conversations around anti-radicalisation and anti-terrorism, and that's definitely a major area of interest. And we've spoken about Prevent. Now I know a little bit about Channel, and we've spoken about that before as far as the channel, but there's the different areas as far as Channel's concerned. And I know Prevent's your specialism, but would you mind just telling me a little bit about the whole Channel process, if that's okay?
Well, Channel is an integral part of Prevent. So it's the safeguarding side. I think that without Channel, and particularly the focus on Channel, I think particularly sort of from 2010, 2014 with the Prevent duty, I think it's a part of the Prevent duty that basically wins over multi-agency partnerships and communities, because it's about safeguarding vulnerable young people and making sure they don't go down what's called the rabbit hole through that gateway by early intervention, by understanding what those risks and threats are, what the behaviours might be, and working with a range of multi-agency partnerships and schools, communities, multi-agency partnerships, safeguarding specialists, in local authorities or the partners where there may be sort of any kind of vulnerability, working with children and adult safeguarding. So, and working with our partners in terms of police who do what's called the vulnerability assessment framework, and they work in partnership with the Channel panel, and then on the panel we'll have a range of experts, and when there is an intervention, someone who's working with that individual will talk about what they're doing and how they're supporting them. Also, the Channel panel will also choose a provider depending on the needs of that individual, and Channel's always been seen as something within the pre-criminal space. So if you are able to refer someone early on, they can get that early intervention. Sometimes there are cases where that individual may have moved into the pursuit space, but they're being dealt with within the realms of preventative action and support. And normally you will get sort of a general intervention to see how you can support them, what I call the Maslow side. So it might be a job or training or something they're interested in. And then there might be someone who, if it's an ideology, historically when it was a lot of focus on what I call violent extremist Islamism, you might get sort of like a faith preacher. I wasn't always sure whether I agreed with that, but often that was seen to sort of de-radicalise, but which I agree with, the sort of these ideas of how they'd interpret it, how the individual had interpreted, like the tenets of a faith, for example. Why were they seeing a violent ideology within that? And then you might get a mentor that just looks at well-being and support. And then, out of let's say 6,600 referrals, I think about just over 1,000 would actually meet the threshold after being discussed initially with partners. and that would go to channel. And then I think out of that, it's about 600 that actually receive an intervention. So it's actually quite low numbers if you compare it to the 6,600 odd initial referrals, but that's good that at least referrals are being made. Majority come from education, followed by the police.
I know it's brought in as far as I think it's now a mandatory element within safeguarding training, isn't it? It was a separate entity to start off with, and now it's kind of just been kind of integrated in a little bit more. Well, there's definitely a greater level of awareness around the prevent side of things. I know in the early stages when it first kind of came out, there was quite a lot of negativity around it. I think some people felt that there was a focus particularly on Islamic extremism as far as prevent's concerned. I know there was a little bit of controversy to start off with of going like, because obviously it proposed or promoted British values, but it was this case of, well, why are those better than any other? And that's where there was a little bit of pushback against it. Were you kind of involved or aware of that at the time you first started teaching it?
So when Channel first came out in its early stages in 2008-9, when I was in the prevent unit within APCO, then I think it was that it was a much kind of it was police led. It was a much more sort of simple structure, but it was still around referrals and intervention and support. So then you had the new sort of like so there was obviously learning from that. And then you had the new sort of like coalition government in 2010. They basically took out all the DCLG sort of community work out of prevent, because that government was already just looking at localism anyway and kind of defunding central funds. So funding prevent from top down would never have worked in there. The big society that David Cameron wanted to create, where even they took away things like Positive Futures, youth crime prevention funds, and it all had to be sort of different sort of funding channels and through police crime commissioners. So basically, at that point, there was already this sort of anti-prevent rhetoric going on, and I don't know whether some of that was the government just trying to win points with the previous government, but also communities that felt, well, it's been so youth and women-based, and some of the sort of the historical sort of leaders were not getting particularly funds. So this is my analysis. So I think there was negativity there already. And then it just became very focused around intervention providers that were picked by the government, and then interventions. And at that point, it wasn't local authority led yet until the prevent duty in 2014, in the wake of and after the rise of ISIS. And before that, you had the Shamima Begum case, where before the prevent duty was implemented, that those girls had already been, and girls across the board, and women and young people had already been radicalised for 3-4 years before the prevent duty even came in. That's when it became local authority led with the multi-agency partnerships, the referrals, the safeguarding leads. And it's still kind of like evolving. We're still having to train the channel side and encourage those referrals.
I think it's like many of the safeguardings, isn't it? That sometimes safeguarding is always perceived as I think it's perceived sometimes by some people as a form of punishment or a form of policing. There's a case of you do wrong, safeguarding's then raised on you. You get involved with the wrong people, there will be a safeguarding issue raised against you. But as you kind of described at the beginning there, as far as it's about kind of improving understanding, it's about kind of improving community engagement. I think there's a real misapprehension as far as safeguarding. It isn't to punish or condemn or blame or shame. It's to try and promote appropriate support to kind of go, look, we don't want this to get any worse. We don't want this. It's one of the only areas that I feel that sometimes the government gets it right to a degree, that it's not just reactive. It sometimes is focused on the preventative or the proactive. Like, don't wait until they've they've been fully radicalized and moved away, or actually acted in or engaged in an act of terrorism. Let's see if we can intervene earlier than that and try and help them to see or develop their empathy, or see why they are feeling disenfranchised or feeling need to be part of this as far as how they've been radicalized. Would you kind of agree with that on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at the prevent and channel interventions early on that were very focused around violent extremist Islamism, and then you look at what it looks like now. So basically, when you look at trends and emerging risks and threats of extremism and how that affects those that are vulnerable, some may have already passed through the gateway, down the rabbit hole, through the gateway into extremism, but those that haven't, well, you can see already that up until around 2014, you had a lot of young people and women particularly, and young women being radicalized and being, having lots of different roles as radicalizers themselves, radicalizing other girls, to be, perhaps jihad brides, but also, with specific roles to sort of spread those ideologies. And then young boys and women who were vulnerable, who took children over. And then when you look at around lockdown, and then what the work we're doing around lockdown, we're started to do a lot of far right. And that was because we're getting a lot of training because of the emerging risks and threats from all our partners, including the Met Police and the counterterrorism analysts units. So that was giving us an idea of what those risks and threats were, and we're able to integrate that into the training. And then you saw kind of like the rise of the complexities of the far and the alt-right and how they radicalize increase as long as we keep on training and reading and researching. And then when you look at now, the picture is changed. So you can see those sort of percentages. So before you might have had something like 30-something% was violent extremist Islamism, and 30-something% might have been far right, and then, or even into the 50%. But then when you look at the numbers now, it might be 30 and 30, or like the far right is more. But then you're looking these emerging other risks and threats like violent extremist misogyny, incel movements, and school massacre fixations, and then single issue. And then they also have now what's called LASIK, I think it's called, which is left, anarchist, and single issue. So they don't have many. It used to be called MUU, which was mixed, unclear, unmoderated. But then they didn't like that and they've changed it. But I still prefer mixed, unclear, unstable, because actually when you look at those definitions, they really make sense, because you can fit lots of ideologies into a mix, especially something like called jihad maxing. When you look at people like Andrew Tate, who has identified as his interpretation of Islam, but then he's supporting the far right. And then you've got these podcasts that are going on with certain groups that aren't necessarily extremists, but they are seen kind of like they might be gateways because they challenge, they don't like prevent, they challenge government policy sort of from the sort of Islamist Islam side, and then doing interviews with people from sort of the far right. So there's dialogue going on between them because they're finding common causes. So it's really interesting. I think I don't want to mention the names because I don't want to, but I've seen a few interviews of those two parties coming together. So is that what you call jihad maxing? I don't know, but I think it's a very complex picture now, and to be on top of that complex picture, you need to do a lot of research, a lot of reading, and a lot of listening, and be aware of what's going on globally and geopolitically as well.
Yeah, there is. It is a strange landscape out there at the moment, as far as exposure to information and groups is so much easier to kind of do that. So when I started teaching Prevent, I really didn't have a lot of experience from the kind of the Islamic side of the perspective as far as radicalisation is concerned, because Grantham in Lincolnshire is an incredibly culturally undiverse place. So I would say the best way of describing it. But I was much more aware of the kind of the far right movements, and those kind of things are much more common around this area of an experience. I witnessed and experienced racist behavior or comments from a white supremacist point of view. I've not really encountered racism on or any extremism from other sides. I think when I do talk about it, though, there is, even then, it was kind of some of the one of the subjects I speak about in Prevent. Rather than going down the kind of religious route, you've also got some of the animal activists, for instance, were a big thing at the time when I started kind of teaching it. So some of the things that PETA were doing, I was just thinking then as well. Obviously, we've got this Stop Oil campaign at the moment. That do you think organisations like that are moving towards the kind of the terrorist kind of or radicalisation kind of mentality? Are they going to be something that Prevent would pay any attention to at some point?
Well, I think that Prevent has become a lot more sort of based on intelligence now. So the fact that they've got this single issue sort of category. So basically understanding that it isn't just about Islamism or violent extremist Islamism, because actually Islamism is just a political system and Islam is a religion. And so I try and call it violent extremist. And then when I call it religiously motivated, well, actually, when you look at it, there's not a lot of real faith in it. So even then it's controversial. But so for example, I think it's understanding the definition of extremism, non-violent extremism, violent extremism, terrorism, radicalising, and radicaliser. So if you understand all those, and then there is a particular group with an ideology, not a clear ideology or a fixed ideology, and they fit any of those terminologies, or they pass through that gateway into an act of terrorism, then it's terrorism, is it not? But then again, when you look at the definition of terrorism, everyone will tell you there is no one definition of terrorism. But people do have definitions of terrorism.
Of course they do. And the famous one is like Nelson Mandela, that was described as a terrorist from one side and a freedom fighter by the others, wasn't it? It's like very much, sometimes the perspective is set by those who win.
Which is why we need to understand better, and I don't think we have done, and we've not utilised enough British values. So whatever you want to call them, united values or pillars of society or pillars of democracy, understanding rule of law, individual liberty, tolerance and respect, which I believe is equality and human rights, and then the other one, which democracy, which is the most important. And that is important because obviously when you look at the rhetoric of the far right, they want accelerationism and the storm to actually demise and break up democracy so they can have ethno-states, for example. So I think in understanding all those, if partners or Prevent trainers can understand all those elements, and I think the training is more robust and better, but I think it has to be much more multifaceted in the environment that we are in now. And I think we need to focus it on young people and be much more braver on how we train Prevent. I don't think we're brave enough in terms of the topics and challenges. And I think half the reason is because I don't think Prevent has necessarily enough experts that understand Prevent that they're out there training. It's very hard to train someone up very quickly in the complexities of history, of, what I say, ancient civilizations, because even ancient civilizations and colonialism and all kinds of like historical movements actually have a real, those narratives are being used by extremist groups now, unless you have that knowledge as well as current knowledge and geopolitics, as well as understanding about democracy and the education system and vulnerability. I mean, how complex is that? How many experts are there that know all that? It's not easy.
Very true. And it's always that I remember my dad always talks to me. My dad's always been very interested in history. It's one of the areas he really loves. And he always talks about history repeating itself. And you can see that all over the place in different guises, different names, but it just go around on this circular. And I know you and I read an article that you'd put together and put out on some of the stuff that was narrating on some of the stuff that's going on currently, or has just been going on. It seems to have it seems to be it's quieter in the media at the moment anyway, at least, than it was a few weeks ago with some of the riots that were going on. And I looked at it from a very psychological point of view because I'm like, well, it's humans being humans. And therefore, that's no wonder we're going to get a repeat because humans haven't really evolved culturally over that time, or biologically we haven't really evolved. Culturally, we kind of have, but it just keeps repeating back to the biology and stuff. So it'd be good to talk about that a little while. I just want to come back to, you mentioned about the British values, and I think that's one of the things that maybe is a bit of where people misconstrue the idea of the kind of whole prevent side of things. We kind of just touched on it very briefly there, of kind of that it isn't about saying we're right and you're wrong as far as ideologies are concerned, or views and values to a degree is concerned. It's just saying we currently work in a society where there is a right to have those different views and different ways of thinking, that we have a democracy that allows us to vote on whether we agree with something or don't agree with something. And that's what it mainly comes down to, isn't it? People trying to oppose those particular values, you said, are coming into that realm of extremism. And then the acts that they then do are potentially what we might class as terrorist acts.
Absolutely. And that's why the part of individual liberty is important, as long as, I suppose, that individual liberty is within rule of law and doesn't cross into that threshold of extremism. And I think we need to use British values, as a measure, but we also need to look at it through a lens of human rights and equality, particularly human rights. So, we do, even young people, they have a right to follow their faith, have a culture, to freely have that as part of their identity, but they also have a right to express their views. And if you look at the UNCRC, and we have and as what I think we're called, they're the duty bearers, young people. We're kind of like state actors. We are there to make sure that those are enshrined in society, and that we are safeguarding young people and enabling them to live within a society of human rights, and equality. So that's really important. When you look at, world conflicts at the moment, are we allowing young people to understand the complexities of conflict, but giving them a safe space in which they can talk about and understand and negotiate that? So actually what we're doing, we're nurturing the next generation of leaders within the realms of British values and democracy, individual liberty, human rights, and not actually radicalising young people. And I think that's an area we've not actually explored at all. I think prevent, from having sort of left formally prevent, I think that's been done extremely clumsily and not necessarily responsibly. But I'm not saying that's happened across the board. I think there will be schools and educators and people who have done a fantastic job during this very difficult time in the last few years. But I think we need to look at that, because I think prevent does not look like what it did in 2009.
No. So the landscape has changed a little bit. And I think it was obviously in people's minds quite a lot for a while, and mainly because of obviously the terrorist attack that occurred that was still fresh in people's minds and stuff. And it definitely seems to have been a shift in focus. I haven't heard really of anything being mentioned around prevent other than from yourself related to the riots that have happened recently. That's not kind of been referred to, whereas it was referred to a lot. It was in the media. It was a newer law at that particular time. Now, I know that when we're making a referral, as far as we do have a concern of whether a young person or an adult is at risk of radicalisation, if I remember correctly, because it's been a while since I taught it, as far as it looks at the three elements as far as risk is concerned. So it's a case of, do they have the capacity for violence or terrorist acts? Do they have the skills and ability for terrorist acts? And I think there's one other as well.
I think it is.
Say again, sorry? Intent, that's it. Yeah. Yes. So could they do it? Do they have the intent to do it? And actually, do they have the skills to do it? Are the three areas that need to be ticked to meet the criteria for being not for just being referred, but for then going through the prevent process. I think if I remember that correctly, it's like a savant moment there. It all came flooding back to me as I was imagining through the presentation.
Police partners are experts at that.
Yeah.
Channel panels, they're absolute experts. And then it's discussed, obviously, amongst the partners and the multi-agency partnerships within sort of channel panels. Yeah. But it is discussing that, and obviously, the quality of a channel panel is experience and also knowledge, which plenty of people have. So, that whether prevent is defunded in areas or not, channel is an integral part. I think it must be within local authorities, an integral part of safeguarding sort of protocols and procedures and strategies.
I think it's interesting. Is there much evidence coming through is there much actual statistics now showing the effect or the effectiveness as far as channels concerned for de-radicalisation and reintegration into normal society, I suppose?
I think anecdotally, I can tell you that I think there's great examples of where, and when we do training, we have lots of case studies that we talk about. And then when I was a prevent education officer, when we talk amongst sort of our colleagues, we talk about success stories. And then every sort of quarter, we put a prevent narrative together and we talk about basically sort of like the cases, where there's been successes, risks and threats, what are the emerging sort of trends. So a lot of DFE and Home Office have a lot of data on those success stories, but absolutely on the whole, it's very successful.
Yeah. Obviously, you've mentioned a few things where there is still holes in it. It's still not perfect. There's still some massive areas that they need to be improving on. But I do find it quite interesting. I think it's a great example. I said it's much more preventative, but the whole name of it is more preventative than reactive. And I think it's a pity that they can't utilize similar models for things like knife crime, for instance, as far as rather than trying to let's punish them when they have a knife, let's see who's most likely to be involved in knife crime or carry knives and try and educate, build them a better sense of community, redirect them, whatever, all the stuff that kind of kind of preventative strategies kind of initiates, that actually there's numerous areas as far as young people's lives, particularly, that could be utilized a similar model.
I agree. And I think there's still even debate whether incel movements of violence, misogyny and the school massacre fixation should even sit within prevent.
Yeah.
So I think there is a space that could be a wider space that we deal with those grooming and vulnerability and young people going down the criminal route, because I don't think it's just single. I think it's multifaceted when you look at the vulnerabilities and when you look at what are called push and pull factors. So push factors are those vulnerabilities and pull factors are environmental issues that will pull that young person into that world of extremism and radicalisation. It's not just that it might be being radicalised in extremism or as extremist ideology. It's going to be a range of things that make them vulnerable. And then when a young person or an individual is vulnerable, you'll see that there's mental health issues. There might be a cycle of abuse. There might be trauma. There's a whole host of issues that have got them into that space. I don't know what you do when people are calling those that have righted sort of, potential either prevent or they've gone into the pursue space. I don't know, but how would you deal with it en masse? Something like that. I mean, I think it's very difficult. But the point is, a lot of young people have been radicalised, particularly extremist learning from sort of extremist Islamist groups in the far right, and a lot of it is online, unmoderated. So I can't see how even current legislation around controlling internet is going to work on unmoderated platforms like 4chan, BitChute, Discord. A lot of extremism chat goes on. How do you moderate them if they're not even within the sort of realms of your own legislation and borders? And also across the Atlantic, English speaking, through the language of English, Europe to US, US to UK. You've got different groups with different sort of wings as well, European wings, US wings. I mean, how do you stop that? And it is mass radicalisation. And I think I noticed that you've used Allport scale as well in some of your training. I was having a little nosy, and Allports is the best. I think is a fantastic model to look at how mass radicalisation, and how has there been mass radicalisation across the UK because of a range of factors of possible leaders that have been very loose and irresponsible with their rhetoric, with algorithms, with what happened in Brexit, kind of already laying down the foundations of being creating sort of like, xenophobia against Europeans. They're not even based on colour, just based on being different and feeling that, jobs are at risk, education, health, just using all those like basic sort of societal needs to create sort of hate and division. Now that's very scary. If you already had a test, run in Brexit, what were you expecting now? Because even people of my dad's generation who, were saying, oh, we don't want Europeans here. And I'm saying, hang on, what do you mean you don't want Europeans here? And I know probably it's not nice of me to say, but, I'm a very proud daughter of an immigrant. My dad was an immigrant. As British as you feel you are, and I feel very British, I actually feel very English as well. I've got a Bangladeshi part of me. I've got a Muslim identity. But, immigration and movement of people is a natural part of society, of globalization, etc. But to then point your finger and say when you are an immigrant, and I think immigrant in the most positive sense of the world, I'm very proud to be daughter of an immigrant. To then point your finger at like young people who come over from Europe who are our teachers, our doctors, our nurses, our pharmacists, that's very irresponsible and that's scary. And you're seeing the same now that it actually was, because there's no Europeans to point at now, so you might as well point at people who are visibly different. That's very, very frightening, particularly for me when I grew up in the 70s, born in the late 60s, in the 70s, and saw that kind of hatred and thought it kind of died out. Well, it hasn't. And it's easy to radicalise people in terms of hate. We have to be responsible.
100%. I think one of the things that I find across the board, as far as controversial issues like or that some people find controversial around things like immigration and stuff, or all the things that I find where there's these massive polarization of views, is that both of the extreme sides oversimplify. So there is one half, or kind of more towards the end of one side, they're going, you should just accept everybody who they are no matter what. And then you get to the other side going, but I don't want to. They're different and I don't like it. And what we tend to do is look at the two polarized sides and go, this isn't overly simplified. Why can't they see what I see? And I actually had a disagreement with my dad about this, because I consider myself to be quite liberal and open. And I'm like, I don't really particularly feel patriotic or nationalist or anything like that, because I'm like, it's just, I'm going to put this quite crudely, it's just when my parents happened to have sex that I was born here. And therefore there's a little bit of like, that's it, it was chance. I could have been French. I could have been here, there and everywhere. It's kind of irrelevant to me. So although there is elements that I like elements of our culture and I am proud in some aspects of it, it doesn't really particularly bother me. It's not part of my identity for me personally. I'm just me. However, my dad kind of spoke to me and he was talking about, but for walking down the street that you've always walked down and then suddenly hearing very, very different accents or voices or languages being spoken, it's hard. And he kind of put it in quite an eloquent way that was kind of like I understand why they're here. I understand what they want to be here. And I don't mind them as people, but I just find it uncomfortable because it's a big change for me.
No, of course.
And that's where I think people don't always accept the nuance of going, it's okay that this is weird for you. It's okay that this is a bit uncomfortable. It's not okay for you to kind of then, be taken to the streets and try to throw them out and stuff. But it's okay to just be, this is a bit odd. It doesn't make my dad a racist, because he was raised me very liberal and stuff like that. But he just kind of expressed it but it's odd for me and it's uncomfortable and it's change and accepting that it should be okay for me to find change uncomfortable. And I think that's where people do struggle, don't they? That's where you get this big clash of ideas because they struggle with the nuance of the middle ground.
I think there's several reasons for that. One is that we live as society, we live in silos, and not just like community, ethnic silos, but we actually in the UK, let's be honest, we live in middle class and class-based silos, and we have done because of the way society is being built. Where I've always said, funny when you go into the suburbs, it's all big walls, isn't it? and yet you still kind of know your neighbours, but you don't. And then I think that obviously there's, changes of demographics in community. Everyone has a right to feel safe in their community. So you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and safety and belonging. That's really important. Where there's vulnerabilities, where there's been lack of investment and there's increasing crime, we look at, are we looking at it through a lens of race and age and culture? Or are we looking at through a lens of, well, that's what's happening because there's been lack of investment and it, a whole host of other issues and education issues and supporting young people. I mean, the fact that 90 projects in 2000 and what was it, 2021 were defunded. No, sorry, 16. I'm getting all my years. 2012 were defunded, 90 projects for youth crime intervention. And then suddenly, after that, you've got mass radicalisation, you've got mass sort of night crime and gang culture. No one has actually talked about what happened in the wake of Positive Futures, did they? Never. I've never heard that. I mean, the fact that they defunded the women's strand of Prevent and suddenly you've got, girls being radicalised. No one's actually mentioned that. So in communities, I think there's also been there have been demographic changes. My dad came to the UK in the 1960s. He came, studied to be a pharmacist. People came for a whole range of issues. It's not been well documented, but after the First and Second World Wars, the UK it had a dying empire or the end of its empire. It needed a workforce. It used as it had used the empire to build its own wealth, whether people agree with that or not. It also used the empire from the empire to build the wealth of the UK that we enjoy today. And then when I look into my own history and I speak to my parents, and they've only recently opened up about this. I think before my dad died 14 years ago, he told me that my granddad had stopped a communal riot against a Hindu family when there was a British partition. My mum only told me a few years ago, my granddad, who was was a Sufi Muslim, he worked for the British Army, and that's why none of us died of hunger in the Bengal famine when there was 2001 Black Lives Matter riots, and people were starting to talk about things like the Bengal famine and etc. And so all those conversations come up. Now, I think and I mentioned this in the article, we suffer from historical amnesia. Not even I know my own history. That is an absolute shame. Why have we not talked about history? Why have we not talked about this joint common history? Because it's not been in the curriculum. And because it's not been in the curriculum, I've lost my identity. I spent most of my life thinking, why am I here? I don't belong, until I realised that I do belong. And I have a very long history with the UK. My forefathers do. And the thing is that even you look at history in the UK, and you look at the poor laws, and you look at all kinds of social division and awful policies that used to, deprive poor people within the UK. And then into the second, and the Industrial Revolution, the First and Second World War, where society started changing. I mean, the fact that we've never discussed this openly, and we've just basically been given a very, very different view of history, that is why we are here today. And that's why people will turn around and say, I don't know why that person is in my community. So what is it? How do we heal that? Is it that we share? Does it matter whether we have different religions or different faiths or different beliefs? What matters is value. So what are we valuing? Are they shared? And can we, and I'm not talking about the British values, I'm talking about core values of human beings. Can we build a society that is also based on tolerance, respect, humanity, human rights? And we all have a stake in that. It's not just people from white communities, it's about people from even my community.
Let me ask you a question. Do you ever find the pressures of supporting, teaching, or caring for someone else overwhelming and wish you had access to more support and information? The Able to Care podcast, in connection with Able Training, has created the ablehub.uk, where for less than the price of a coffee a week, you can access exclusive podcast content, resources, events, and over 45 certified online courses, covering topics like self-care, understanding dementia, neurodiversity, first aid, conflict management, financial advice, and so much more, with new content and courses being added each month. We are so confident that you will benefit from the Able Hub that we are offering 14 days access completely free of charge. No contract, cancel anytime. Become part of the ablehub.uk community and gain the support, knowledge and resources you deserve. Don't struggle alone. Be able. Find the link in the description. Going back to kind of my dad's position is a case of, do we just go, well, they're just wrong, or going, well, why are they feeling like this?
Yeah.
You know, what's the reason for this? Why are they being drawn to this extremist view? Something is making them feel disenfranchised. Now, that could be, you know, baby throwing dummy out of pram and it's not fair. Yeah. But again, it's kind of going, but that won't get us anywhere if we just then kind of judgmental and kind of going, well, they're just wrong. We have to go kind of like, well, what's not working here for them and for, there's obviously a significant discomfort due to change occurring somewhere that, you know, they are feeling disenfranchised, whatever. And it may be a case of they're wrong. But
bringing communities together.
Yeah.
So, for example, I have no issue as a Muslim taking an old granny across the road safely and getting her to church, and even sitting with her. You know, if and I've done that plenty of times. I absolutely love churches. I love the sense of community, and sometimes I feel that, you know, we may have not had. You know, I think there's some great community sort of mosques, but also there's also those grievances of, like, you know, women don't always have a space in mosques, you know, and when I look at, like, growing up in the UK, and I look at how, you know, maybe like there's an demise of like practicing Christians, but there's still a lot of people that go to church. But what value is that giving to community? If you didn't have those churches, you wouldn't have those people coming together, those lonely old ladies that have lost their partners, and people that are supporting them, giving them a sense of community and safety. And I think we need to replicate something like that. It might not have to be faith-based, but to open up spaces as well as faith spaces, which is some mosques have started doing. They realised, oh dear, what on earth is happening here? And then they went out with tea and like biscuits and stuff, and like giving people hugs. Now that's lovely, but we need to spread that model. And I personally think, without offending anyone, mosques need to be way more open and community led. So when you look at like early Islam, during the golden age, they were places at madrasas, which you hear now when people like have negative sort of thoughts. Madrasas were places of learning, and they were like houses of wisdom, and they had translations, and they had people coming together. And I think that even girls and boys would go to madrasas in the sort of Middle Ages and stuff. And you had them in Damascus, and you had them in Baghdad, and you had them in Cordoba. And we don't know anything about this, do we? So, you know, young people, I just remember going to like Arabic class and feeling very bored and very disenfranchised. And then like when my dad eventually brought the imam home, it was like, oh no, Pride and Prejudice is on. Why is he spoiling Pride and Prejudice? So do you see what I mean? It's just like, where did that beauty disappear? That beauty of learning, of you know, of knowledge. And that's where they translated things like, you know, maths and science and astrology and all astronomy and all kinds of like philosophy from Greek and from, you know, like Indian and from Persian text. Where has that, you know, that's all lost, isn't it? We don't have that. People don't even know about it. When you talk about it, they think you're making it up. It's part, you know, that like, you know, even things like algorithms came from Al-Khwarizmi, and it was like, you know, a Muslim scholar. It's like, oh, why are you lying? And it's like, no, we're not. It's like, it's the history. So like that sort of sense of belonging and bringing people together and learning and nurturing, it doesn't have to be just about faith. It can be about all kinds of things. So I think we've lost that, and I think that we need to sort of come together on a more modern model that works for us all.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I'm from a very skeptical. I'm a humanist. I don't belong to any religious faith whatsoever. But one of the things that religion does have and wins hand down, they are amazing at building communities. And it's the one thing that the secularist society hasn't been able to replicate in any meaningful way. And there's a lot to be learned from religions, or religions kind of going, hey, look, this is what we're really good at. Let's not just keep this to ourselves. Let's not use it as a proselytizing tool to draw people into us. Let's just focus on the actual real positive of this, which is just building a sense of community and connection amongst human beings. And I think that would be a wonderful world as far as, believe you want, but always welcome for a cuppa. Do you know what I mean?
Of course. And I hope we go down that route. And I hope that, we're able to sit down with people like your dad, all of us, and talk about our stories. And actually storytelling and historical storytelling has really helped heal, communities and showing shared stories, which I think stories are history. And that's where we really let ourselves down on telling each other about our diverse histories, that actually they're shared histories.
It always reminds me of the, and I've spoken about it on the podcast before, which is the rat park studies. And the rat park studies was related to drug use and substance misuse. But it's basically rats in understimulating cages would potentially choose drugs over sustenance and die as a result. And then they introduced the idea of the rat parks, which are highly stimulating, socially engaging environments, where then the rats stopped taking the drugs and started just sustaining their lives. And you can see that mapped over. I read a study related to knife crime, which was 3 different cities had 3 different approaches to knife crime. 2 of them engaged in stop and search, and 1 of them engaged in improving funding towards community projects. Yeah. And guess which one caused a reduction in knife crime?
Oh, absolutely.
And that's exactly the same thing with the stuff that's been going on with the, with the riots and the extremist movements that have been happening just recently. Again, it's this disconnect, this lack of community, this feeling disenfranchised, and therefore we need to create just giant theme parks. Essentially, is my solution to it. We all need to go up to Alton Towers and have a laugh.
Oh no, I agree, and I just think that's the world we need to work towards. And at the same time, we need to look at society and where people are in need, and how do we mend that, and how do we create more equality and access to education. I think just even the fact that from 2012 young people have had to are getting into debt for education, and then you close borders and they can't even go to an English speaking university in Holland.
Yeah.
I mean, where you can just pay €500. I mean, a PhD in Spain is €600, and I looked it up in the UK. It's £20,000.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Wage. So I mean,
I'm heading over to Spain to get my PhD, definitely.
And there's more English-speaking universities as well, which is really, really interesting. Because countries have realised that it's a lingua franca, and there's people from all over the world. Even Madrid is way more diverse than it was 25 years ago when I was living in Spain, with people from all over the world in Asia. And even I've met Bangladeshis that are studying at university here through English.
Yeah.
And so it's I think I think we need to look at those. Our student, even having international students, they create the fabric about they bring their skills, their knowledge, and even many of them stay and they'll build their families and communities and stuff like that. All that, my dad was part of that. I think the interim Prime Minister of Bangladesh now was one of my dad's friends at university, and I didn't know that, but he was. And they were a part of a group that went across the globe, but many of them went to the UK as well.
Yeah.
And they created their families and their communities. And we've gone off into sort of middle class, mainly white communities, but we've tried to integrate and be part of the community. That isn't always the case. You can't always, you will live people that look like yourself. That happens in Spain with British people, where they go and live in Orihuela, and not in the middle of Madrid, surrounded by Spanish people, near a mountain like I have done. I only manage that because I speak fluent Spanish.
Right.
But, so I don't feel a barrier, and I've got other common values with my neighbours. So it doesn't matter what religion or my ethnicity is. So I think there's a lot of different models we can look at on how to integrate and get people to understand each other's life journeys and life stories, and not feel grievance and angry, but actually see how we can, come together and work together to build a better society. That's why it's really important to focus on young people and open up opportunities for them.
Yeah. And cultural education
as
well.
Yeah. Especially with the far right and Iran extremist Islamists and other single issues, really focusing on young people. We don't have control on the online space. Even if we dip in and out of it, we don't have a narrative there. We don't have any influence there, and we have to be very, very worried about that, because that is an extra layer of influence.
Yeah.
When you look at Maurice Massey's value map, that's an influence of, especially when you look at channel referrals and the number of young people under, I think, is it 19, and then there's a large number, 11 to 14 or something like 90% are male, and then there's a big percentage in that age group. I mean, that is very, very worrying. So what are we doing to combat that?
Yeah.
Because we don't have control of that in our borders with internet, do we?
No, which is a concern. But it's no real way to pull it under control to some degree. There's just 1,000 ways around it. So if we draw it back for a second, just to kind of helping kind of parents or teachers or whatever, what potential warning signs should parents and teachers look out for as far as potential radicalisation is concerned?
Well, the checklist is generally like things like using new language, behaviour, negative behaviour, argumentative, sort of like using different like platforms. Teachers and educators must be knowledgeable about that platforms. When I was doing the training in 2020 and 21 particularly, during lockdown, and they were hearing about these platforms for the first time, I mean, that was quite an eye-opener for a lot of educators. So we need to be on the ball about what's going on with young people and understanding their vulnerabilities. And, so generally those will be the kind of things, particularly their online behaviours. And then if that is like manifesting in any other negative behaviours. So teachers, parents, family, friends, we all have a role within that. And I think there's Act Early, that came out a few years ago, which is a process for people within the community. I don't know how successful it is. I was a bit disappointed that they used only one mums group to consult on that, when there's a whole load of diverse mums groups, particularly online ones, like that could have consulted. So I think even we must, when we're creating programs, we must make sure that we are consulting with as many diverse communities and demographics as possible. And I think we keep on just doing the same thing and not necessarily consulting across the board. So our product that we come out with is not always what it should be. But I'm sure despite that, I'm sure Act Early, we mention it in the training that people would consider. But I just think using Act Early if they're part of the community, but they just need to understand what those risks and threats are, what they look like, what their behaviour is like, what those push and pull factors might be, so those vulnerabilities, and what those external factors might be. But they also need to feel confident. So if you don't feel confident in making a referral to a designated safeguarding need or straight through to police, I mean, who realistically is going to pick up the phone to the police officer and say my child is on 4chan? And I'm a bit worried. They're going to talk to other people before. So is that the bit we're missing? That engagement, that safe space, that buffer. So, prevent is only as good as the policymakers who create it. And the policymakers, my message to them as an ex-official prevent officer is you need to listen more to people and not just sit in a bubble and think it's like this, because it is. You have to really understand communities. And I think unless even the prevent world, what I call the prevent elite, look like the communities that they serve, like the police has to look like the communities they serve, we're going to make the same mistakes over and over again. So they even have to diversify in that world, have people from all walks of life, different religions, but some of the think tanks and things like Hope Not Hate, I think, and other organisations, they tend to bring people like Hope Not Hate. I think they bring a lot of people who've been like far right activists. So, if government can't do it, do we have civil society fill in that gap?
I think even the NSPCC, for instance, I think you can go through that. And I think there is worries for people that if I go straight to safeguarding, that's it. I can't take it back. And what if I'm wrong? And they're all the things that people worry about as far as, will my child be taken away from me, or those sorts of things? Because I think that's all the negative stories you get around safeguarding. People hear the negative in the media rather than the, as I've spoken about on other podcasts, other people, you hear about the case where, mother has baby taken away when shouldn't have, or safeguarding didn't take somebody when they should have. You very rarely hear about the mother struggling, safeguarding comes in, offers some support and some additional behaviour management training, and manages to ensure that the parent and child are much better off and improve their well-being. That's never in the news. So it's exactly the same in the prevent, isn't it? Going, a child going down a dark path ends up intervention, re-education, support, ends up joining a community that is now playing football once a week. That's just not what you hear. So I think sometimes the charities, as you said, Hope Not Hate and the NFPCC sometimes feel like a stopgap to kind of go, hey, and maybe I can ask them and they won't jump on it and force me to do anything I don't want to do. So, yeah, that's good advice.
A lot of organisations need to now stop being anti-prevent, and they need to look at prevent in fresh eyes. And if they don't like what they see, they need to be part of the dialogue to shape it to something that fits the purpose. I'm still getting asked questions in interviews. What about communities who are negative about prevent? Always really wanting to say, oh, there's some people within Muslim communities. That's an old conversation now. The game has changed, society has changed. And I think I said that in an interview, and I'm not sure they were very happy with what I said, but it's true, because we're not dealing with just violent extremist Islamism. ISIS might exist, but in a very broken down form. Yes, there is this violent extremist Islamism narrative going on, but there's a lot of the, people across the globe that are very worried about what's going on in the Middle East as well. There's far right narratives, and there's all this like moving from one sort of area of extremism to another. Allegiances that are not helpful. And to me, the world is in chaos now. We're at a point where we have to really act fast and be, intelligent and clever, and look at where all those risks and threats are. And we have to be really multifaceted in how we sort of like support our immediate communities, our immediate family, friends, and like wider society. And we have to have a dialogue now with those that are running the show. They have to start listening. So it has to be a hybrid of what was happening in the beginning in 2008 with they threw a lot of money at communities. And when I was doing my prevent, it being called pink and fluffy. No, it wasn't. Actually, women were learning about, what extremism was, how they could support their families, online safety, support, dialogue, talking to partners. So it needs to be something like that with Channel, with all the learning we've done from the prevent duty, but as well as the community engagement, but not just focused on Muslim communities, focused on all communities, all vulnerable communities, where we all have dialogue and we come together. So, if pink and fluffy means bringing communities together, then I say bring on pink and fluffy, because I think, it does work. There was a lot of good that came out the first prevent. And we didn't do that when ISIS was radicalising left, right and centre. And look what happened. That was a disaster. To me, that was a disaster. We let down a whole generation of young people because we weren't prepared and they weren't prepared for the ashes of what came out of Iraq from Al-Qaeda into ISIS. And that was a massive failing on our side. And we're reaping the negativity of that now.
Yeah. Okay, so as far as when you're teaching around this subject, just kind of a bit of a kind of a closing point, from just because obviously governmental change, systemic change is something that needs to happen, and that does take the actions of individuals to kind of make that happen. But just on a day-to-day, is there things that teachers, parents, caregivers can do on a day-to-day basis to kind of help and reduce the risk of radicalisation within the children?
Understand geopolitics and what's going on in the world, and give children and young people a safe space to discuss it. So what's going on in the UK, give them a safe space, give them, even bringing out, if you can't manage the conversations, bring outside people who can, like Hope Not Hate or NFPCC or other civil. I mean, we had loads of like really good Stand Up as well is a great organisation. I think there was Solutions Not Sides that looks at the Israel-Palestine situation, all great speakers. Bring other people in and look at your local authority who can help you or put you in the right direction. And then I think also understanding referral pathways, getting refreshed Channel and prevent training. The online one is fine, but I don't think it gives you the nuances. I think go and do some good, robust prevent training that is up to date. And he's talking about the current risks and threats, understand things like vulnerabilities, try and understand those topics as well, even if it's just one teacher or a couple of teachers who, have related experience to understand some of those risks. And then definitely online safety. Don't just look at the platforms that you know about, think about the platforms you don't know about, and don't just think of it through, like, it's not just radicalisation, it's all kinds of grooming, like sort of sex grooming and bullying and harassment and incel movements and, across the board. Understand that world, because, and if you don't understand it, bring an expert in to talk about that world so you understand it and we can safeguard our young people. And then I think definitely look at what UNICEF are doing, even if you're not going to adopt their programme. But in London, apparently the mayor's paying for it. Rights Respecting Schools programme. Children don't understand the basic tenets of equality and human rights, and that's a very successful programme in actually helping young people live by those values and those behaviours of human rights, and it's really successful. At least implement something similar.
Well, thank you so much for your time and jumping in. I feel like I've stretched you on a Saturday afternoon and could be out there enjoying the weather, but you've come in and spoken about Prevent with me. So that's really appreciated. So thanks so much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed it, having a little chat.
It's been fantastic.
Good. Thank you again for your time, Sabera. And we'll put details of, obviously, I know you offer some services and things like that, so we'll put a bit of a link in the show notes to that as well. But thank you. So for those of you who are listening, thank you for listening as well and for watching. And if anything that we spoke about today you found interesting or engaging, please like, comment and share. And pass on the information and look into some of the things that Sabera was mentioning there as far as routes to improving practice or to raising awareness, definitely. But okay, thank you. Have you ever encountered an adult or child's behaviour that has felt difficult, overwhelming or challenging? Have you sometimes felt at a loss of what to do or know that you didn't handle it quite right? People are complex and unpredictable, and their behaviour can be like the weather. We've all made the mistake of looking out the window and feeling safe to wear shorts, but 5 minutes later wishing for an umbrella. What if, like a weatherman, you understood how humidity, temperature and pressure all come together to cause the weather, allowing you to better prepare, predict and respond, and prevent ever having a picnic ruined by a thunderstorm ever again? My book, called Targeting the Positive with Behaviours that Challenge, helps you to become the weatherman of behaviour. It provides you with a toolkit to increase competency, confidence, resilience and empathy, so you feel more assured about how to respond to distressed or dysregulated behaviours in others, including those affected by trauma, mental health, neurodiversity, learning disabilities or dementia. Build better connections, achieve de-escalation and improve outcomes for yourself and those you engage with my celebrated 6-stage target model, a step-by-step process to reduce distress for everyone. Discover my empowering, person-centered guide in Targeting the Positive, written by me, Andy Baker, available from online bookstores worldwide. Find a link in the description and order today.